shortly. Once again, we're about to start the webinar, exploring the relationship between bullying and substance use. This presentation and webinar is sponsored by the Children's Safety Network. It's important for us to acknowledge our funding sponsor, which is the Health Resources and Service Administration of the Department of Public Health, Department of Health and Human Services. And this is under the Child and Adolescent Injury and Violence Prevention Resource Centers. And this is a cooperative agreement that we have with HRSA.
All right, and some technical tips for today's webinar. If possible, please join audio via your computer. If you cannot, you can join through your phone by pressing the three dots in the bottom of by pressing the little down arrow on the microphone and clicking switch to phone audio. If you experience audio issues, you can dial a phone number found in the Zoom invitation and mute your computer speakers. And you are muted and you do not have the ability to unmute, and you will also not have the ability to turn on your camera. And if you have any questions, you can use the Q&A button found at the bottom of your screen to ask questions at any time. This session is being recorded and the recording will be available within 1 week after the webinar ends. And you're able to enable your captions by clicking the more icon, then the little captions icon at the bottom of your screen to turn on automatic captions.
We are fortunate to have two superb speakers that will be presenting today. The first is Dr. Laura Crothers from Duquesne University. At Duquesne University, she serves as a professor in the Department of Counselor Education and School Psychology, and she conducts research on childhood bullying. Our second speaker will be Chuck Klevgard from the Education Development Center, and he's a nationally recognized expert in the area of substance use, prevention, and public health and school-based health. Thank you for joining us, these two superb speakers. And I'm the guy with the bow tie. I'm Charlie Irwin, and I head the Division of Adolescent Young Adult Medicine at the University of California, San Francisco, and the UCSF Benioff Children's Hospitals.
Good afternoon. As Dr. Irwin mentioned, I am Laura Crothers, and I'm going to be talking first about the issue of bullying, and then I'm going to segue into its relationship with substance use. Next, please. So many of you probably are intimately familiar with bullying, but I'd like to review some of the definitional components of bullying just to make sure that we have a shared understanding of what we're referring to when we review the research findings about bullying. So through decades of research and multiple sources of expertise, bullying has been defined as instrumental or aggression that is non-provoked. So it's not in response to another aggressive episode. The behaviors tend to be reoccurring, although not always, but they tend to be a part of an ongoing negative relationship between a perpetrator and victim. And there has to be, this is probably the most important aspect of the bullying definition, is a power differential between perpetrator and victim. And as we'll be talking about, the power differential does not have to be a physical one. It can be economic, social, verbal, but the perpetrator has some sort of escalated power base that the victim does not share. When we're talking about bullying, we like to say that it's normative, but not normal. So normative meaning it's very commonly occurring. So probably in the most widespread national study about bullying done quite a while ago in 2001, about 30% of children reported moderate to frequent involvement in bullying episodes. And I've seen estimates vary from 20 to 90% of children being involved in bullying in some way during their school careers. And it is a serious problem, one that has been recognized as a global public health issue. So it's not something that is just in the United States. In fact, it's been studied around the world, and our European counterparts were the ones who actually got us started on this topic in the 1970s. Next, please. So the first thing I'm going to be talking about are the two direct forms of bullying. And then I will talk about the three indirect forms of bullying. Probably the most frequently recognized form of bullying is physical bullying. And this is just using one's body to victimize another. It can include physical assault, hitting and kicking, but it also includes vandalizing someone's property, stealing from someone. We know that boys are more likely to engage in physical bullying than females. And these are probably the most easily recognized forms of bullying. 8 to 21% in a more recent study have reported being physically bullied at school. Next, please. The other form of direct bullying that we talk about is verbal bullying. And I've seen this described as abusing and accusing. So using words to insult something about the victim, a characteristic. Again, the bully uses the power difference between themselves and a victim to harm through words. And as you might imagine, this is even a more common form of bullying than physical bullying, with 18 to 53% of students reporting verbal bullying during the last year. Next, please. Now we're going to talk about the 3 forms of indirect bullying. And the difference between direct and indirect bullying is typically direct bullying is easily observed by adults, so that physical and verbal bullying. But we also have forms of bullying that are more subtle, more insidious. The one form of bullying that has been talked more so about in the last 10 to 15 years is cyberbullying. And researchers have identified the same 3 elements of the definition of traditional bullying: the power imbalance, the wish to cause harm, and repetition of unwanted behaviors. But the modality of the bullying occurs electronically. So we see bullying occurring through iPads, through computers, through smartphones, and many children and adolescents have presence, an online presence in social media. And I listed a few. I'm sure there are many more that I'm not aware of. And they seem to actually increase the opportunity for both perpetration and victimization. Next, please. The last 2 forms of bullying that I like to review are relational and social aggression. Sometimes these are lumped under one overall construct, but I think it's valuable to differentiate them, because relational aggression occurs primarily in a dyad, so between 2 children or adolescents. And the intent is to inflict psychological damage upon the victim. The kinds of behaviors that we generally see in relational aggression include sarcasm, ignoring, eye rolling, and the purpose is to damage self-esteem and make the victim feel, I guess, uncomfortable and insecure in a relationship. Next, please. And then the last type of indirect bullying that I wanted to talk about is social aggression. This is probably the most sophisticated type of bullying that we see. It requires that a perpetrator has a group of participants that at least are somewhat willing to work with them. So the social group is manipulated into being the vehicle of harm. And so we see behaviors such as gossiping and excluding and social isolation. These behaviors seem to be more sophisticated because they require the knowledge of how to manipulate or gain allies of a group of children and how to subtly influence and orchestrate other people's behavior to inflict harm upon a victim. The result of social aggression is a diminishment in social standing, which ultimately damages children or adolescents' self-perceptions of themselves in social contexts. Next, please. So I like to talk both about the effects of bullying upon victims, as well as the effects of bullying upon perpetrators, the effects of engaging in that behavior, because both are poor. So some of the effects of, and there's been a lot of research on this, but some of the effects of bullying that we like to highlight for victims are emotional sequelae, including anxiety and depression, sometimes school phobia, behavioral consequences, avoiding school, basically fear-governed behavior, avoiding the typical risk-taking that would be appropriate for this age, and academic. So reduced achievement and school performance. And we also see health risks, more likely to engage in substance use, which we'll be talking about, long-term depression, cardiovascular risks, and then somatic symptoms like tummy aches and headaches. Next, please. In addition, you might wonder why would a perpetrator also suffer from negative consequences, but we do see that perpetrators also seem to bear costs for engaging in this behavior. So depression and mood lability seems to follow the engagement in these behaviors. Moral disengagement, lack of objective perspective taking. There are also correlates to perpetration, including conduct disordered behavior, later risks for criminal behavior and domestic violence. And then also, to our point today, health risks such as engaging in substance use. Next, please. So just as a segue, when we move to talk about substance use, illicit substance use is seen as one of the largest public health concerns for this age range in the United States. There's a strong, research has now established a strong association between involvement in bullying and the risk of engaging in substance use. And both perpetration and victimization seems to be related to an increased risk for illicit substance use. Next, please. So this is a little bit complicated, but I'll try to make this as succinct as possible. There are different risk factors through multiple pathways. And some are developmental, so some are just related to adolescence itself and the changes in the brain that occur during adolescence, and some seem to be brought about by the actual experience of victimization. So the first is the neuroendocrine dysfunction. So we see in victims changes in the structure and function of the anterior paralimbic system, which includes the orbitofrontal cortex, amygdala, anterior cingulate cortex, the insula, and striatum. They occur following pure victimization. And then we also have what is happening normally, which are developmental changes in the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. That HPA reactivity occurs during adolescence, which renders an individual vulnerable to chronic stress exposure. We also see another pathway of comorbid mental illness. So depression, anxiety, and other serious forms of mental illness, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, may mediate the relationships between peer victimization and use of substances or alcohol. We also have the developmental pathway, or it's not a developmental pathway, but the pathway of gene by environment interactions. So a genetic variability, as well as the experiences of peer victimization on social stress analysis, which then is related to executive dysfunction, depression, and pain. And then sibling aggression. So oftentimes bullies and even victims are victims at home through siblings. And so we do see depressive symptoms and substance use. related to sibling aggression at home. Next, please. So the National Youth Risk Behavior Survey, all of those years, has established the relationship between self-reported school or cyberbullying victimization and previous 30-day alcohol use, drinking, marijuana, cigarette smoking, electronic vaping use, with effects being significantly greater for females. Next, please. So in terms of alcohol, we know already that 9% of adolescents report drinking alcohol in the previous month, with 4.7% reporting binge drinking, which is also associated with cyberbullying. Underage drinking is associated with an increased risk of addiction. There seems to be certain individuals that are more likely to use alcohol. So white, Latino, African-American victims, also female bullies, male bully victims, so those who are bullied and then bully others, female cyber victims, and female victims seem to be more likely to use alcohol. And what is worrying to us is that half of adolescents say that alcohol is easy to obtain. Next, please. Marijuana use, again, 12.5% of adolescents report the use of marijuana in the past year, also seen as easy to obtain. In a recent study in Florida adolescents, there was a relationship found between cyberbullying victimization and marijuana vaping, and bully victims and cyberbullies seem to be more likely to use marijuana. Next, please. In terms of drug use, either prescription drug use or non-prescription drugs is a behavior that we see in adolescents. During 2016, 11.8 million individuals, 12 or older, misused prescription drugs, and both traditional and cyberbullying victimization has been associated with misuse of drugs. Next, please. Cigarette smoking, also associated with traditional bullying. Cyberbullying seems to be a risk factor. We know that white victims of bullying tend to be less likely to engage in smoking, whereas Latino bully victims are more likely to engage in tobacco use. And we do see some mixed relationships between vaping and bullying victimization. Next, please. So if we were to kind of bring it together, we see bullying perpetration has been associated positively with all types of substance use, drugs, alcohol, tobacco, in general. Bully victims tend to have somewhat weaker effects in that relationship. So bullying perpetration is associated positively, bully victims somewhat less so. So adolescents and children who bully their peers have a higher risk of substance use during their life than non-bullying peers. Next, please. There seems to be a mutuality between bullying and substance use. So episodic and frequent bullying predicted substance use at follow-up measures, follow-up times. And the associations between these appear to be bidirectional. So bullying makes one vulnerable to engage in substance use, and substance use makes one vulnerable to engage in bullying behavior. There is a dose-response association between bullying perpetration and substance use. Next, please. We don't well understand the relationship between being bullied and engaging in suicidal behavior. But we do understand that bullying victimization predicts subsequent depressive symptoms and suicidal ideation. We also know that drug use, specifically cannabis use, and suicidal ideation have been positively and reciprocally related over time. Next, please. Just as a final note, there are a few protective factors that have been identified in the literature. This one very unique study done among Beirut high school students found that religiosity levels seem to mediate the relationship between the vulnerability of bullying and engaging in substance use. We know that parental nurturance, support, and monitoring of behavior tends to be a protective factor. And of course, and probably most importantly, culturally congruent treatment strategies. Next, please. And the references will be available. Thank you.
Would appreciate you answering our poll, and if you could respond to this, the most important reasons to focus on both bullying and substance use include, and we have a variety of choices here. So we'd appreciate you doing this because it will help us further understand the needs of our participants.
Looks like we had about 75% of our participants respond, and the majority responded with all of the above, and then had about equal for the other three options.
Now we're going to move on to Chuck's presentation, which he will be talking about substance use and bullying and the intersections between these two critical issues.
Awesome. Thank you, Charles. I am pleased to be with you and privileged to share the stage with Dr. Crothers. It's an exciting opportunity to kind of reinvest and sort of re-energize the folks who work with me on my team around these issues and these intersections. I feel like I'm building on a really solid foundation from Dr. Crothers that had to do with sort of looking at what we're learning about those intersections in terms of where they co-occur and the bidirectionality of these issues with one another. So what I will do in this next segment, in the next 20 minutes, is to do a more nuanced look at a couple of issues. One of them being that not all populations are the same and not everything is equal in that sense. So we'll begin to start with the idea that sort of understanding what these relationships tell us, but moreover look at sort of the issue that people are not impacted in these different groups in similar ways. There's real significant differences in the impact of bullying or victimization. There's also significant sort of differences in interventions. So they're not all created equal. So it's important as folks who work in the field with prevention and substance use and bullying prevention together to understand sort of which interventions have the potential of impacting both issues and which have more evidence and which have greater sense of being able to impact those with sort of higher levels of risk. So again, sort of looking at more of nuanced. So next. So as we talk about those intersections, it's several points. I appreciate Dr. Crothers sort of pointing out this sort of when we're talking about correlational relationships. In the field of substance misuse prevention, it's clear in terms of understanding that risk and protective factors or other kinds of factors, and when we say correlational, meaning they're not causal. A doesn't cause B, and sometimes B can increase the risk for A. So I think that's some of what I'll try to keep clear as we sort of look at some of these issues and understand associations or correlations in this context are more likely what we're talking about. So at that beginning poll where folks felt like the research has been really clear, I think it's clear in terms of we're understanding that it's important to look at these issues because they have these relationships. But the exact nature of these associations is less clearly understood. So it's important that we sort of do that work together to understand what those relationships are. Next. So that the early work that I was involved with in bullying, going back to Olweis and my days at Hazelden many years ago, understanding sort of three groups, and I would suggest to you more that there are different groups and even beyond 3 or 4, sort of bullies, victims, and bystanders, which I think the initial sort of ways in which folks thought about groups that were involved in cycles of bullying. I think that there are now a whole lot of evidence for understanding bullies that have also been victims, in particular in that sibling environment is one of the ways that Dr. Crothers pointed that out. So thinking about these groups is one more way of calling out that when we say bullying and we think about programs, it's important to think about for whom. And so what's the goal of that program? Who is that going to impact? What's the intent of what we're trying to change? To prevent in terms of which groups. So again, this sort of reminds us that again, sort of different populations we're talking about, and we'll get into even deeper nuance in just a moment. So next. So again, I won't belabor some of what again has really been covered about. There's really lots of really solid sort of research about the association between bullying and substance use among adolescents. That's really clear, and it's there are large studies, meta-analyses, systematic reviews, so you can find really good information about what those correlations are and how significant they are. Some evidence that bullies and victims have higher risk for drug use. So again, I think there's less evidence there with regard to understanding exactly the nature of illicit drug use, or when you talk about, again, something like heroin involvement, it's certainly clear that as tobacco, alcohol, cannabis, those relationships seem clearer. And bullies have a higher risk for cigarette and alcohol and cannabis than bystanders. So again, it's sort of evidence was being done to understand the nature of bystanders years ago. And I would say that while it seems less of an emphasis currently, what I would say is that I think because we don't know as much about bystanders, I don't think we should dismiss them. An important point to make, if I'm in an agency, my public health group or a coalition, as we think about witnesses of violence, substance misuse preventionists, sort of have long sort of understood that when you witness violence in your family, not just being a victim of violence, but when you witness violence occurring in close proximity, and whether that be your family or even your neighborhood, that increases the risk for substance misuse. So I think that same is true. So on the extreme ends of bystander sort of exposure to violence, exposure to bullying, exposure to harassment, there are impacts and effects that should be understood and considered when you're developing programs and policies. All right, next. Some of what I think that, again, this makes that point, and it's helpful as you're talking to your own organizations and staff and groups. And again, so what's many of you work in coalitions in those settings, to talk about that bidirectionality. So in addition to A impacting B and B increasing the risk of A, there's also issues that help us understand that for some bullies, drug use may be part of an overall involvement in antisocial behavior. So in that way, it might be thought of as a byproduct of their engagement with groups of peers. Now, important to point out, because again, that suggests if that's a present sort of driving factor in the community where you live, is that it seems more associated with antisocial behavior than the interventions you think about would be different. And again, there are specific ways we can think about addressing antisocial behavior with groups, and again, sort of promoting pro-social involvement in significant ways, sort of again, looking at a cluster of factors that relate to antisocial behavior is one of the ways of addressing both issues. And next. One of the other nuances that I think is important in that intersection, both with substance misuse risk and with bullying, is the issue of discrimination. So again, the sort of terminology we talked about, sort of, it's not normal, but pretty normative. Discrimination is commonly experienced by adolescents, so it's not something that we just experience as adults. Most young people will talk about what they've witnessed, what they've seen, what they've experienced around discrimination. So both attributes of discrimination and bullying co-occur. So again, they travel together. So one of the things that's helpful in the way that I talk with substance misuse, and I think the same would be true in the context of groups working on bullying, is to break down discrimination a bit. I think a lot of the research about interventions and changing discrimination has to do with understanding the different components of. So often, again, sort of discrimination starts at a more basic level of stereotypes. And stereotypes in this context could be labeled, as a way of attitudes assigned to labeled entities. Again, it's sort of a clinical way of thinking about stereotypes, the beliefs that people are a certain way because they belong to a certain group. Helping young people and folks in your group understand that stereotypes is a basic foundational way of thinking about discrimination, because unchecked, stereotypes allowed to continue could lead to prejudice. Now, prejudice is the actual endorsement of negative beliefs and attitudes within those stereotypes. So that takes it a step further. So if you believe a stereotype and then you begin to make a judgment about that, that becomes prejudice, and now we've gone to a different level. So again, that opportunity to intervene has changed in this case, that we've upped the ante to prejudice. Now, finally, then, the definition of discrimination that's helpful to think about here is behaviors that act to endorse or reinforce stereotypes and create a disadvantage. So again, when we say attributes of discrimination, name the ones that you're familiar with when you can quickly think about how do we discriminate at the community level. We do that with housing, opportunity, access to services. Those are very real and are tangible ways to have people understand what are examples of attributes of discrimination. So those things occur along with risk for substance misuse in significant ways. A lot has been written, and again in study 2, about bias-based bullying. I'll come back to the study in just a moment. I think that it sort of ties some of these pieces together. But bias-based bullying is again, it's not random. It's when bullying has the intentionality of addressing someone based on a perceived identity of the target. So again, there's sort of been a lot of research about bias or identity bullying, and it's based on sort of how you perceive someone. And again, it's based on prejudicial beliefs, often focused on differences. So a couple of studies have looked at the impact of discrimination or bias-based bullying. One in Boston sort of looked at groups of race and ethnicity, immigration status, perceived sexual orientation, and weight. in terms of physical weight, and put folks in groups, and again found significant differences within these groups, that often, again, that discriminatory practices were based on prejudicial beliefs. And again, lower status played a big role in that research. Sort of issues like homophobic or weight-based bullying were sort of, again, about specific attitudes about what negative associations of folks that are overweight or minority sexual orientation individuals. So all of that, again, sort of points to a couple of things before sort of leaving this conversation, that identity-based bullying is something that can and should be thought about at the development and selection of programs, at the development and implementation of policy in lots of ways, because it is in many respects a big part of what may be driving an aspect of bullying. So I think that, and again, Dr. Crothers made this case well, so I'll sort of reiterate here that we know that when folks are victims of this kind of bias-based bullying, they are also at greater risk for depression, suicidal ideation. So this study sort of bared that out in that particular way, of access to my resources at the end as well, or references, knowing that all of the groups that I mentioned here had higher correlations with depression and suicidality. All right, next. So I mentioned a moment ago, so folks who have multiple identity issues where there might be marginalized or places where folks are, where there's discrimination or prejudice, have significantly been studied with regard to what's the impact of intersectionality. So with regard to substance misuse, we've begun to understand probably a decade ago, and again, I think the women's movement helped us understand this, that when you have multiple sort of factors of your identity that in fact present stereotypes or prejudice, they compound or even multiply risk for substance misuse. So if you are a female and you're a minority, a sexual minority female who is Black, your risk for substance misuse isn't just 3 + 3 + 3, it's more like 3 × 3. So I think in that case, we're sort of looking at sort of the multiplication effect. So same would be true as we understand the issues of bullying. So when prejudice and bias-based bullying is playing a role in a community, understanding how to think about and address some of these issues that are very prominent there is an important part of prevention, of knowing that intersectionality will place some groups at much greater risk than others. So again, sort of solely looking at a risk or protective factor or a population that is at risk, consider some populations that share multiple sort of identity factors that present risk for them. Before leaving this piece, is sort of what are some things that people have done about this at the community level? I think there's a lot. Sort of looking at incorporating maltreatment experience as a risk factor for peer victimization. So when clinical folks do assessments, beginning to ask questions about maltreatment or bullying in that case, or other kinds of issues where folks, and again, what's been the motivation for you being picked on, is an important part of any kind of an assessment. Sort of mapping risk and vulnerability factors is becoming more and more common, sort of looking at recommendations, including that kind of work in a treatment plan or a care plan or a community strategic plan for prevention. A lot of folks sort of looking at the evidence for creating buddy systems for at-risk children or students who have experience of maltreatment is growing in sort of popularity and some levels of evidence. Cultivating and maintaining social relationships and strengthening social support networks are all sort of part of the plan when folks consider multiple kinds of issues with regard to the two conversations we just had about discrimination and intersectionality. All right, up next. want to highlight what's again sort of more commonly understood risk factors for high risk substance use. So if you're in the field of substance misuse prevention, these are really common and well understood and long known risk factors. Again, that sort of the more of these you have, the greater likelihood that you may get involved in substance misuse, have an earlier initiation of substance use, or again, engage in this case, engage in riskier substance use. So I would say the research is clearer when you look at risk factors that correlate more directly to high risk drinking or high risk use. So not just looking at risk factors that associate with someone who's going to pick up a drink at 15 or 16, but folks who are more likely early initiators or young people who are again more involved in high risk behavior with use, meaning that binge drinking or other sort of risky behaviors associated with use. So understanding that sort of on the higher range of substance misuse, those risk factors are more strongly correlated to bullying. So again, sort of family history, parental attitudes are common. The parent monitoring and parent substance use issues for reasons again that relate to again what someone may experience or witness or deal with in several contexts. Association with delinquent or using peers is a stronger piece that correlates with bullying in this case. Lack of school connectedness, and then again, low academic achievement has that directionality issue, sort of leading to challenges academically or lack of academic success, having somebody then move into substance use. So childhood issues, mental health issues. So these again are ones that are more commonly and more highly associated as risk factors with bullying. So want to say a bit more too about sort of the chicken or the egg. That directionality issue is important to look at in a number of places, including here. I think that as folks think about which came first, is that both are true in that case. So when we're in the conversation about sort of looking at issues of identity or what we would call sort of discrimination in risk, I think people, even individuals who perceive that they'll be discriminated against are at greater likelihood to not seek services or engage in connectiveness with communities or peers. And again, then that sort of lack of engagement or hesitance to get involved with communities or with peers then presents a risk in and of itself. So this sort of directional that sort of continues to move forward, and the response to a risk factor creates another risk factor in that sense. So that would be true as we look at all three of these issues of sort of discrimination, intersectionality, and sort of high risk factors. Next. All right. So often I think we want to also take a look at sort of risk factors for being bullied, and sort of looking at sort of what we know from that research is clear. So, and again, I think I'm close to at time here. So understand that these are different than other risk factors, and what we would suggest as interventions is clear here as well. Let me go next to this socio-ecological model, and then we'll tie this up. So next slide. And these relationships have been talked about. So again, sort of just highlighting with purple there where those intersections are that we've talked about in the last 10 minutes, as well as what Dr. Carruthers talked about as intersections as well. And next. All right. And you can click all the way through this. Sort of looking first at protective factors at different levels is helpful because it sheds the light on what we need to do in terms of considering interventions. So again, as we consider protective factors along the top for substance use, again, we see issues of family support as being protective, disapproval of youth, parent engagement, school connectedness, societal norms, structural determinants of health. Again, in a positive sense, it can be protective. You see similar kinds of issues across the bottom. So school connectedness is a body of research that relates to safe spaces. Parent and family engagement on the top is protective in terms of looking at sort of the family components of being able to teach skills and have conversations. So issues with regard to safe spaces, another sort of difference there about the protective factor has to do with even things like parent-child teacher conferences have shown to be effective in reducing issues of bullying on that side as a protective factor. So last slide is looking at sort of some strategies and sharing again some places where you can think about intervening. Overwhelmingly want to make the case that sort of emotional regulation skills or social emotional learning programs have been shown consistently to impact both bullying and substance use risk. And again, for some of the same reasons that you heard Dr. Carruthers talk about at the very beginning with regard to sort of pathways, as well as sort of teaching strengthening families and customized strengthening families for bullying prevention, shown to be very effective. Safe and supportive schools, and looking at whole child, whole school, whole community, which is WSCC, which is a CDC intervention that really, again, focuses primarily on substance use prevention, but has shown consistently to have impacts and outcomes associated with the reduction of bullying and victimization. Lots to do with societal norms, improving social environment. And again, I wanna stop so that we have time for Q&A.
Okay, thank you so much, Chuck and Laura. This is Cindy Rogers. I am with Children's Safety Network, and I am stepping in for Dr. Irwin. He seems to be having some technical difficulties. So until he's able to join us, I'm going to moderate this. Oh, looks like he may be back with us. Dr. Irwin.
Yeah, I'm sorry for some reason.
Oh, no problems. I'm glad you could come back. So I will leave and let you moderate. And let me just remind all of our participants to please type your questions for our presenters into the Q&A pod. So thank you very much. Okay, over to you, Dr. Irwin.
So I haven't, the questions have not appeared for me, so I'm not certain.
I think that what happened when you had the technical difficulty is that the questions did disappear.
Disappeared.
So I'm going to go ahead and read those questions for you, if that's okay.
Sure, that's perfect.
All right. Okay. So again, everyone, please go ahead and type your questions in. We already do have a number of questions, and I'm going to throw this out to both of our presenters and perhaps you as well, Dr. Irwin, you might have some responses. So one question is, do you think ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, plays a part in bullying and or substance use, and both? And I see some heads nodding. So let's start with you, Laura. How would you like to answer that?
So ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, really, I think, are linked to every problem that we have talked about today. The intersectionality of vulnerability through community, school, family, and then individual vulnerabilities then just make the coping and the availability of resources that much more difficult. And so that would be, I would say, yes, I believe that would be a strong contributor.
Thanks. Chuck, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, just adding quickly, I think that there's growing registries or sort of ways to identify strategies that prevent the accumulation of ACEs. I think early on people were like, why should I study or work in prevention with ACEs? Because in fact, what if I've already accumulated 7? You know, so it's like, it was disheartening. Whereas I think the second wave of research looked at how can you do prevention or build resiliency with folks who already have accumulated risk, and how can you prevent the actual accumulation. So look for both kinds of research. So we're talking about younger people who maybe haven't accumulated 6 or 7, but maybe have 2. There's different strategies than for folks who have accumulated a lot of risk already in terms of building resiliency. So make that differentiation and know that there's good evidence for both kinds of strategies.
Thanks,
I would-
Chuck. Charlie, do you want to add to that, please?
Sure, I would just highlight, we have been using ACEs in our program, but on our clinical program, but what we've done a lot of work with is working with Medicaid to really support the payment for the screening, because screening is great, but if you can't get interventions that are paid for, it's, it's a really big thing. So we've with our state Medicaid program, which is complicated in the state of California because each county has its own Medicaid program. So you have to work with each at the county level. So I would urge people that are really embedded in county public health or social services to really get engaged, because we can do the screening, but the big job is getting kids and families treatment.
Services. Great. Thank you. I'm sure we could talk about that one question for the next half hour, but I'm going to move on to some other questions, and I'll throw this out and see who would like to answer it. Question is, how can schools more effectively address bullying and provide conflict resolution skills? Any thoughts there from any of you? Laura, you're shaking your head, so I'll go to you first.
So in the bullying research, we like to talk about that bullying is not a child problem, but it is a social ecological problem. It's a systems problem. And so schools really bear the responsibility to create the environments that are inhospitable to bullying. And there's been so many research studies about how to do that, but some of just the highlights, the meta view of the problem is the caring, nurturing, close-knit, small communities within schools, particularly bigger schools, that it is everyone's responsibility, all adults in the school, to be on the same page regarding reporting and intervening in bullying, not pathologizing bullies, but instead working on other ways to encourage appropriate assertiveness, also getting victims the support that they need. So that would be some of the things that I would highlight. Chuck, I'm sure you have other ideas.
Yeah, just building on Dr. Crothers, I think sort of looking for programs at the school that have a comprehensive whole system approach, meaning that if it's just taught in the classroom, it's taught by the health teacher, it may have some impact or even get to the outcomes that are in the program literature. Whereas if you really want to make systemic change about changing an environment in school, look for ones that consider educator wellness, that have strong parent components, that have community engagement along with them. So again, it's sort of hearing young people who are sort of understanding how they can regulate. I have a young person who was in, I think, our 4th or 5th grade, who told me they were in their amygdala and I just needed a few minutes. It's like, oh my gosh, that's so hilarious. But knowing that person was going to take the time to think about choices that they have, A, B, or C, and what the consequences of each one would do, would obviously impact substance misuse decisions as well as bullying.
Great. I'm so sorry that we are just about out of time, and there's a bunch of other great questions. I'm sorry, audience, that we're not going to get to them, but I want to ask each of you if you want to just leave our participants with one parting thought.
I would like to say, don't blame the kids, because I think the structural issues are really fundamental for change.
Great. Thank you for that.
It's easy to blame every teenager.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Laura, any closing thoughts for you?
I would echo that and say that this is an adult problem and not a child problem, both from the vantage point of bullying as well as substance use.
Great. Thank you. And Chuck?
Think about opportunities for partnerships. I think we're sometimes quick to worry about sort of siloed coalitions or competing for the same funding. I think programs that are more successful are less worried about sort of how they're going to support staff and more worried about how they're going to build relationships and create partnerships across sectors.
Great. Excellent advice from all three of you. I want to thank you all so much for being with us today, our speakers as well as our audience. Great webinar, great information. And we do have an evaluation. We're going to show you that link. There's a quick survey there. If everyone would take a moment to complete that, we'd greatly appreciate it to help us improve future webinars. So with that, we're going to say goodbye and thank you so much for your participation. Bye.
Thank you.